Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in for your normal host, Donna King, and we're going to have a little bit different debrief this time around. As we get closer to the end of the calendar year, we're having more and more people looking ahead to 2026, and especially what's going to be happening with the elections of 2026 in North Carolina. For that purpose, on this edition of the Debrief, we decided to talk to some of the experts about what is likely to happen in North Carolina's upcoming elections. We're chatting with Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University, and Andy Taylor of North Carolina State University. It's a very interesting conversation. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on this special edition of the Debrief. A lot of us aren't thinking quite yet about 2026, still thinking about the holidays and what we're going to do for Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's. But I know that you, as esteemed political experts in North Carolina, are at least thinking somewhat about what's coming up in this new year. And so I'm going to ask each of you, first of all, what you're going to be following most closely in 2026. Let's start with Michael Bitzer.
Well, thanks for having us. I'm going to be watching, of course, I think like everybody else, the U.S. Senate race here in North Carolina. You know, the predictions are perhaps $750 million could be spent both by candidates and external groups on this particular race. But I think the real indicator to me is going to be what's going to be the mood of the country. We oftentimes know that midterm elections tend to be referendums on the president and the president's party, particularly when they control Congress. So I'll be watching, kind of what the mood of the electorate is like. Are they positive? Are they negative? And in particular, what do they think about the economy? So kind of, setting aside the big race here in North Carolina, I'm kind of looking at mood behavior and what the feelings of the electorate is going to be like.
And that certainly could have an impact on that Senate race and many of the other ones. Chris Cooper, what else are you going to be focusing on particularly?
Yeah, so many things, right? One off the top of my head, though, is the North Carolina General Assembly races, right? We have, of course, nobody has a supermajority right now, technically, but the Republicans would argue, and I think the data's been in their favor, that they have what's essentially been a working supermajority, right? They've essentially been able to override the governor's veto by just getting one or two Democrats on their side. Look, I don't think there's any way in the world that the Democrats get a majority in either chamber, especially the Senate. But can they get that sort of working majority away from the Republican Party? I think is sort of the biggest electoral story, at least from my perspective, to watch. And then the thing, even before we get there, I'll sort of try to get two out of one here, Mitch, is the Berger-Page primary race, right? I've gone back and looked. I don't know that we've seen a state legislative primary in modern North Carolina history that is potentially as important as this Berger-Page primary. We'll see how it pans out in the end.
Well, all of those tie together because the General Assembly and Berger-Page are all very much linked. Andy Taylor, what are you going to be focusing on particularly in 2026?
Well, you kind of left me with the U.S. House, and I guess that's what I'll go with anyway. I was going to choose that. Obviously, nationally, not just in North Carolina, the Republican majority is very slim, and maintaining a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives is going to be vital if any further elements of the Trump agenda are going to get passed in the 120th Congress, in the next Congress, the last Congress under Trump. Beyond North Carolina as well, I'll be looking at what is happening, and North Carolina is one of these states, in states where Republicans have done mid-decade redistricting. Picking on the Republicans here rather than the Democrats, because the tide, mid-term tides, as Michael suggested earlier on, are going to tend to go against the party that holds the White House. And so it's going to be the Republican mid-decade gerrymandering rather than the Democratic mid-decade gerrymandering that is going to be tested here. And it'll be interesting to see if there are states where, because of pushback against the president's party, Republicans actually have of acting in a way that's um, counterproductive for them. So in North Carolina, that might mean something like, did the redistricting put actually, instead of winning one, the first district, is it possible that it could have put, well, maybe three, but maybe, as we mentioned earlier on, 11 under threat? And so those are the kinds of things I'm going to be looking for.
Well, I should not be surprised at all that when I made notes of the things that I definitely wanted to get covered, we've covered almost all of them, at least on the surface level at the beginning, because all of you are focusing on some of the same things that interested me. But we will circle back on some of these issues and get into a little bit more depth. First of all, I should note, if you are watching this program and thinking, wait a minute, the people aren't sitting on the orange couches with the debrief sign behind them. No, you are in the right place. This is the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly program. This is a special edition looking ahead to 2026 when we're talking about the big elections that are going to be on the table. I'm Mitch Kokai, and I am joined for this conversation by Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University, and Andy Taylor of North Carolina State, all of whom are esteemed political science experts who've been following North Carolina politics for a number of years. Let's circle back to the big marquee matchup that we talked about at the top, the U.S. Senate race. This was always going to be a big race, but for a long time, I think most of us thought this was going to be a matchup between Tom Tillis, trying to run for a third term, and Roy Cooper, who's won 6 statewide North Carolina elections, never lost a statewide election, is probably the Democrats' number one top candidate, if you could pick a candidate for North Carolina Democrats to run in any election. And we thought that was going to be a major matchup. That's not what we're seeing. It's Roy Cooper against likely Michael Whatley, a much less known figure in North Carolina politics, although he has been chairman of the state and national Republican parties. How does that change the dynamics of this race? And is it really at this point Cooper's to lose? I think we'll start with Andy Taylor this time.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. It would probably have gone from, I don't know whether it would have been a lean R under Tillis just because of the midterm dynamics, but he would have come in with significant incumbency advantage to one where it is probably at least lean D, given Cooper's credentials that you mentioned in the question, Mitch, and also the fact that, it looks at the moment as though it might be a fairly tough year for Republicans. Having said that, as Michael said, there's still going to be a lot of money spent, and that's largely because the terrain for the Senate races in 2026, or the contested terrain at least, is pretty narrow. The Democrats need to pick up, well, they really need a net 4 because the Republicans hold the White House in order to flip the Senate. North Carolina obviously is probably number 1 on that list. They will be looking also picking up a seat, for example, in Maine, Susan Collins, maybe, other seats like possibly Ohio, possibly Iowa. But they got to have North Carolina if they're even to contemplate having a majority in the Senate and the 120th. And so, despite the fact that we've swapped Whatley here for Tillis, it's still salivating. And I think there are people across the country who are still going to spend a lot of time looking at this.
Chris Cooper, your thoughts about whether Cooper goes into this as having this being his race to lose, or is it still sort of fairly even?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's his race to lose. I don't think it's quite that clear cut. But I essentially agree with Andy that I think we would have seen, perhaps a lean R with Tillis, but I think now we're looking at probably a lean Democrat. I don't think that was as much as saying it's his to lose. But I think the choice of Whatley is really interesting, right? The Republicans could have gone a lot of ways with this race. They could have gone with Pat Harrigan, for example, right? Somebody who obviously is a rising star in the Republican Party, checks a lot of the boxes that political consultants and the party might want. But instead, they went with Whatley. In a lot of ways, I think this was actually a pretty genius pick by the Republican Party, right? So Michael Whatley, one, he's not going to make any big mistakes, right? This is not going to be a Mark Robbins situation for the Republican Party. He's not going to, have any huge gaffes. He obviously is going to be able to raise money hand over fist, I think, as Michael talked about before. He's not going to hurt the party down ballot. He may not be the most unifying figure, but he's certainly not going to divide the party too much either. And this is, let's remember, the first time in a good long while, probably since 2008, where we've actually had a U.S. Senate race in a year that was going to be good for the Democrats, right? The Democrats have drawn some really bad straws in terms of when the Senate races came up. So if you're the Republican Party and you're saying, who do we want to run? We got to have somebody whose career doesn't just go away if they lose this race, and sort of take them out of another key position. Somebody who's going to raise a lot of money, who's going to keep our party brand up at the state. From that perspective, even if he loses, I think Michael Whatley was a pretty smart pick.
Thank you, Michael Bitzer. Other thoughts that we should know about this Cooper and Whatley race, and how much Cooper has an advantage going into it?
Yeah, I think beyond what both my colleagues have mentioned, I'd be looking at what kind of crossover appeal does Roy Cooper bring to this race come November. I mean, I think what we're seeing in the early numbers, at least according to the Catawba YouGov poll, is that Cooper is pulling about 30% among Republicans saying they approve of him. If that trend kind of continues, that means Whatley has to win even more within the independents within the electorate, and that's going to be a hard sell because he is Donald Trump's candidate, and we can expect to see the president in this state. The question becomes, as always, what is the president's approval rating, and more importantly, the disapproval rating for the president? And is Whatley tied so closely to Trump's coattails that begins to bring his opportunities down? I think there's a lot of room within the next several months to kind of see how this plays itself out. And if we expect North Carolina to be anything, I think it will be, again, a very close, within the margin of most of the polling done as we get closer to November. The margin of victory is probably going to be within the margin of error.
And I'm glad you used the word coattails, because that was the last question that I was going to ask on this before we move to some of the other elections. And that is, how likely is this race to have, if any, coattails down ballot? Will people look at their choice for U.S. Senate, Cooper or Whatley, and then have that help dictate where they vote for the rest of the election, or will it stand alone? And I'll let anyone pick that up.
Well, I don't know about coattails. I mean, I think it will be a referendum on Trump. And so if there are coattails, it will be sort of presidential coattails, or probably, presidential reverse coattails, and that will drive down ballot rather than the Cooper Whatley race itself. I suspect the yeah, I mean, I do think that Cooper does have this probably fairly unique crossover appeal that Michael was talking about that makes him a little bit different. But if we get into November 2016, the president's approval rating is somewhere around, in North Carolina, somewhere around 43%, then that is, that's bad in itself and is enough to sink a few Republican votes further down the ballot, regardless of what happens in the Senate race. I'm not talking about flipping the General Assembly, for example, as Chris was talking about, or even flipping the majority of the congressional delegation, but it could be problematic for further down ballot races.
Very interesting. Let's switch gears now and talk about the U.S. House. So the other side of Congress, on the other end of the U.S. Capitol. We've already talked about this for a bit, but going into this season, you might have expected, okay, we would just look at the congressional map that we had before and see who's going to be vulnerable, if anyone. But the Republicans in the North Carolina General Assembly sort of changed the script on us by responding to President Trump's call to redraw the map to try to help get him another seat or more if they could, but they really only had the opportunity perhaps to get one more seat in the U.S. House out of North Carolina. So the first district becomes more Republican. The third district becomes a little less Republican. And now, if it's an interesting, very strong Democratic wave, perhaps that puts not only the first, but also the third into play. And we've also heard some talk among the national Democrats that they're targeting the 11th out there in the western part of the state, your neck of the woods. Chris, let's start with you. What do you think it looks like in terms of the landscape for the two major parties when it comes to our congressional delegation?
Sure. I mean, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, right? And I think that's essentially what we're looking at here. There just aren't competitive districts left in the state of North Carolina or in this entire Southeast, right? So the first congressional district prior to that redistricting was the only true toss-up, according to Cook Political Report, in North Carolina and in the whole Southeast, right? So if you take that off the table, then all of a sudden the 11th congressional district becomes the most competitive district in the state, which is not the same thing as it's saying that it is competitive. But it makes sense then, right? The Democratic Party is then going to dump money into the 11th because it's the best chance that they have. I wrote a piece for the Assembly about, I don't know, 6 months ago, sort of talking a little bit about the 11th. And maybe even back then, the Democrats thought that if they squinted hard, perhaps they could possibly pull this out. I still think it's going to be really tough. There is no member of Congress who currently represents a district that went this far to Donald Trump in the last election. Doesn't mean that it can't happen. Doesn't mean that a massive wave won't come in. And if a massive wave does come in, I think it is going to end up drowning the Chuck Edwards reelection effort. But it's still a stretch. I think what the Democrats have going for them is they've got right now, as of today, 3 folks who have declared for this office. But Jamie Yeager is clearly the favorite on the Democratic side. I think the Democrats are pretty happy to have gotten him. He is the grandson of a guy named Jamie Clark, who's the second to last Democrat to represent the 11th congressional district back in the 1980s. Jamie Yeager is also a farmer. He's the CEO of Hickory Nut Gap Farm. So sort of if you go to the Ingalls and you get your $9.99 pound of ground beef as opposed to your $5.99 pound of ground beef, that's going to be your good stuff from Hickory Nut Gap. And so he sort of has this rural appeal that a lot of Democrats think is going to play better outside of Asheville, certainly than the last candidates they put up, Caleb Rudow and Jasmine Beach Ferrara and some of these others. So it's going to be an interesting race to watch. Again, not competitive by traditional definitions, but if it's a massive tidal wave, sure, maybe Jamie Yeager wins.
Michael or Andy, beyond the first and the third and the 11th, anything else to watch, or is that really where the action is? The two new districts in the eastern part of the state and that far western district?
Yeah, I think that those are the ones that we'll all be watching. I think Chris's analysis really kind of hits it on the head. The thing that Chris mentioned is a massive Democratic wave. I mean, we are talking about an environment where, yes, the wind is behind the Democrats, but is it enough to push them against some of what we would call the calcified voting patterns in a lot of these districts on the ground? I mean, the party loyalty that voters have nowadays is so indicative from one election to the next that we can really use what happened in the past to really kind of see what the potential is moving into the future. And that's because the voters have become so party loyal now that it's tough to really push them towards voting for the other party. That's not to say that it can't happen in a variety of means, and the most important one that I would think is going to be critical for 2026 is going to be turnout. Registered Republicans, generally have a 5 to 6% advantage over the state turnout rate. Democrats usually tend to meet the state turnout rate. Does that flip And if Republicans are sour on the environment, sour on, lacking energy to get out to vote, and Democrats are over enthused, over energized, that's where those headwinds could really kind of push things. But it's going to take a real kind of headwind that, maybe we haven't seen in quite a while to push those dynamics to be able to move some of those districts.
Can I just jump in on that, Mitch? So
Yes, sir.
Michael's talking about the magnitude of the wave that you would need. So really, we're probably talking at least 5 to 6 percentage points from R to D to put some of the Republican leaning congressional districts in the state really into play. That is of the magnitude roughly of a 1994, I'm talking nationally here, a 1994, a 2006, or a 2018. If we get a 2010, which now again, I'm talking about national figures. If we get a national wave that we did in 2010 nationally in North Carolina, then we could be talking about, some significant Democratic pickups in the congressional delegation in the state. But that's a huge if. I mean, that's one of the last, 30 odd years. Another thing I'd say though about the Republican coalition, Mike was talking about calcified voting and party voting. And that's obviously true. But one thing that Trump has done is change the Republican coalition a little bit in two ways. One, he's personalized it greatly, and the other is he's made it a little bit more downscale. And that has worked pretty well in presidential races, but it's a different kind of Republican coalition than the one that habitually votes in midterm elections, which is party oriented rather than personality oriented. And without Trump on the ballot and without these sort of habitual voters or as many habitual voters, will be interesting to see that if the Republicans can avoid what happened in 2018, which, as I noted earlier on in these remarks, was one of those fairly largish wave elections.
Very interesting stuff. We are actually getting near the end of our time, and I want to make time for one race that we haven't talked about yet that could have some significance. But before we do that, we've already talked a little bit about the General Assembly. Do any of you think that there's any chance Democrats take a chamber? And if not, is their goal to try to ensure that the Republicans don't have supermajority so that Josh Stein maintains his ability to have some sort of say in the process?
Break supermajority.
Yeah. I think it answers your questions in order, no and yes.
Very good.
Yeah,
and of course,
sorry, and I think some of that is already kind of baked in, and I'm not sure how excited the Democrats are about the recruitment process as well. I mean, this is one of the problems especially at the lower levels of state legislature. If you're in the minority for a long time, even if you see an opportunity to make big gains, people are sort of so discouraged that your recruitment of quality candidates is hurt. And my sense is the Democrats are going to have to spend some time turning that perception around.
and of course, the biggest race is that's going to have probably the most impact statewide in the General Assembly will be decided by however many thousands of Republican voters in one state Senate district decide to vote for either our current Senate leader, Phil Berger, or the Rockingham County Sheriff, Sam Page, which could have ripple effects throughout the government. Okay, so in the last few minutes that we have, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to everyone, but I do want to see whether any of you think that the state Supreme Court election, sort of the highest level statewide elected official on the ballot this time beyond U.S. Senate, whether this race between Anita Earls and likely Republican Sarah Stevens running against her, is this going to take on new significance because the last state Supreme Court election got such attention and even a national profile? Is this going to be a really big deal? Whoever wants to answer.
I think so. And I think, we talk about how much money is going to get pumped into the U.S. Senate race. I would be very interested to see how much money is going to be pumped into the state Supreme Court race. This is something that the Democrats have to hold. Republicans want to pick it up, but if it's a Democratic favorable year, this is going to be a critical race to kind of keep an eye on.
Chris or Andy?
I agree completely. I think it's going to be hard for either candidate to separate themselves from the party brand in general, these bigger tides, but it's going to be hugely expensive, hugely important. Let's remember, what was Elon Musk's sort of introduction to American politics? It was the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race, right? That's when he first said, hey, I'm putting a ton of money into politics. This is my new hobby, essentially. I don't know that we're going to see Elon Musk money here, but it's going to be definitely watched and paid attention to.
Andy, we got about 30 seconds for your thoughts on the
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree in 30 seconds with these two guys. But there is a lot of national attention on these races now because there's a lot of national litigation, particularly with regards to election administration and redistricting. And so this isn't going to be any different.
All right. Well, it's definitely going to be a very interesting year coming up. We don't have to think about it quite yet if you're watching this program as it's airing. You could still think about eating your dinner with the family and then celebrating the new year. But for many of us, it's not very long before we start thinking about, okay, who's running? How are they doing? What are the polls saying? And we certainly thank Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University, and Andy Taylor of North Carolina State University for taking some time out of their holiday break to talk to us for this edition of the Debrief. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Thank you once again to Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University, and Andy Taylor of North Carolina State University, experts on North Carolina politics, for their assessments of what's likely to happen and what they're looking forward to with the elections of 2026. Well, this has been sort of a special edition of the Debrief, and the next two episodes will also be a little bit outside of the norm. We have our next sets of Debrief episodes scheduled to air on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. And in those episodes, we're going to be airing an interesting conversation that comes from the John Locke Foundation's Revolutionary Roads podcast. If you're unfamiliar with it, go to johnlocke.org and find out about the Revolutionary Roads podcast, which talks about North Carolina's role in the founding of the country all the way up to the U.S. Constitution. The episodes that will be coming up for your enjoyment. One is called Protest in Petticoats. It's about the Edenton Tea Party and its role in leading up to the revolution. And the next episode that will be airing on New Year's Day deals with the Halifax Resolves. If you're unfamiliar with the Halifax Resolves, this was the document that made North Carolina the first of the colonies to say that they wanted to declare independence from Great Britain. That's the next two episodes of the Debrief, and then coming up a little bit later in January, back to our normal standard of having the week's recap of major developments in politics and public policy. Thanks again for watching this edition of the Debrief, and we look forward to joining you again. Happy holidays.